the Barrowmaze. Ages ago. And
I'm sorry, I can't. This halfling just like, welcome.
I think I'm going to do the whole thing like that. You're tuned in to the Stingbat Radio Network on FM 101.2 KRPG.
Welcome to Dungeon Master Diaries, a podcast about Shadowdark and other role-playing games where two GMs talk about their recent experiences at the table and hopefully give you something useful you can take to yours. On the show today, we discuss Barrowmaze. Well, hello there, sages and adventurers. My name's Jody, and with me, as always, is my good friend and GM colleague, Matt. Weren't expecting that, were you?
Just completely unhinged.
Well,
much like the Barrowmaze.
There it is. Yeah, just wide stretching, and rambling. That's me. Today's episode is focused, as you just heard it, on the megadungeon Barrowmaze by Greg Gillespie. So, Matt, take us to the table.
The wind stirs the mist like a restless spirit. Somewhere, deep in the Barrowmoor, something ancient stirs. Welcome to the Duchy of Eric, a cold, forgotten corner of the world, where the land itself seems to rot. At its heart lies a fetid, fog-drenched swamp known as the Barrowmoor. For centuries, folk whispered of strange lights in the mist, of undead things that crawl from the marsh at night, and of the mounds, hundreds of them, dotting the moor like the backs of buried giants. They call it the Barrowmaze. Ages ago, an ancient people buried their dead in the moor and carved tombs into the earth. Over time, those tombs connected, forming a vast subterranean labyrinth. But death did not rest easy. Long before even these ancient builders, the god of death, Nurgle, ruled the underworld. He foresaw betrayal from his sons, Orcus and Set, and in a desperate gambit, hid his most powerful artifact, the Tablet of Chaos, within the maze, protected by deathless servants and foul wards. His gambit worked. Orcus and Set overthrew him, but now war endlessly in the shadows, each seeking the tablet to claim ultimate power. And so the dead rise. The village of Helix, your home base, lies on the edge of the moor. It's a hard place, full of tougher people, peat harvesters, and mercenaries, and misfits. And also the desperate, like you. The tavern is full of stories. Some say the swamp is cursed. Others speak of gold and treasure buried with the dead. All know one thing. Something terrible waits in the darkness. The dungeon is not vertical like most. It sprawls, wide and tangled like the roots of a dead tree. The deeper you go, from west to east, the more powerful the monsters, the darker the magic, the richer the rewards. Orcus's acolytes and Set's necromancers crawl through the maze like rival insects in a corpse. Their spies have even wormed their way into Helix itself, working through barmaids and advisors, stirring politics from within. Religions clash here too. The old gods still hold sway among the frontier folk, but missionaries of Saint Yig and a word that I can't pronounce bring with them the promise of light, law, and order. Whether you worship nature, death, or righteousness, you may find allies and enemies within the duchy's tangled web. You may begin your journey as mere sellswords or tomb robbers, but know this, in the mists of the Barrowmoor, gold is cursed, and the dead do not rest, and the gods themselves take sides. The maze awaits!
Well, let us gather around the fire and have some 80s D&D cartoon nostalgia. I don't know what that was.
I don't know. I started doing it that way, and I just couldn't stop.
I feel like I've influenced you in a terrible way.
You came in hot with a weird intro.
And we're not even drinking. Good grief. Oh, man.
Hey, man. The Barrowmaze is a weird place. It's a weird module, and we're going to talk about it. But that's my excuse. I just thought, what better to do than two sides of the same coin? Because I think Barrowmaze has. I'm stretching here. It's kind of a study in opposites, a study in dualities, Jody. That's my top line takeaway. The good with the bad, the weird with the normal, etc. The dead with the living. I think that's probably the most obvious.
Cats and dogs.
Get me out of this.
Well, let's put a fine point on that ramble. Do you recommend the Barrowmaze for use in Shadowdark?
It depends.
I hate that answer. So let's get into some specifics, and listeners, you can figure out for yourself. That is actually my least favorite answer. Maybe
I know
of
it's
all
super
time.
unhelpful, but for this,
really,
I think it will be revealed why that actually makes sense.
Okay, did you play the whole thing straight right out the book?
I played every single room, Jody. We did now, like many people who play through mega dungeons. We did not play through every room. And in fact, I actually made a few changes that I just want to hit on up at the top. First of all, I changed the factions and the gods. We used the Warhammer Fantasy pantheon, so the gods of chaos. I made the entire thing centered around undead versus chaos. So instead of like two kind of undead cults fighting each other, I had an undead and a chaotic kind of a war inside the Barrowmaze. And then the last thing is that I gave the players the Barrowmore hex map that you find in the module, and we just kind of arrived at the entrance to each Barrow mound, when in the module it kind of describes like having to look for some Barrow mounds. Some of the Barrow mounds have different attributes in terms of their entrances, etc. We just kind of dispense with all that, and any Barrow mound that they wanted to go into, except for the one that leads right to the end of or part of the end of the dungeon, that one was erased or blocked out with a little Sharpie. So that, plus we didn't use Helix, we used Fellcrest from the 4th edition Points of Light setting. But other than that, we basically played it pretty straight.
Yeah, so the rooms were more or less straight.
Yeah.
Okay. And the wrapping around the pantheons and deities. And
insofar as one can play a module straight.
Right. Well, yeah, that is, dear listeners, if this is your first time tuning in, both Matt and I are filthy homebrewers, and we do hack and slash. So if you hear us review something, there are always going to be hacks and kludges. Now, the greater topic, the mega topic, one might call it, for this particular episode, is mega dungeons in general through the lens of Barrowmaze. So yes, we're going to review Barrowmaze and talk specifically about it, but I kind of want to zoom out, as I often do, and talk about just like, man, mega dungeons are a confusing thing to me. So you got enough rooms that you never ever have to leave this dungeon. Ever is just the mega dungeon concept, or it will take you an entire campaign to get through these hundreds of rooms.
Sure.
And in theory, a story lies within. So everything that a normal dungeon is just mega and bigger. I'm going to be honest, I have never played in one of these. My only experience getting close to playing to one of these was Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil, and I don't even know if that qualifies.
Yeah, somebody's pushing up their glasses and saying, well, actually, right.
Well, actually, it is large. We'll go with that. And
sure.
I did play through that honestly in 3rd ed. But I have no desire to run a mega dungeon. I know for me, my hobby and narrative whims would take me, I would burn out very, very quickly on one of these. I would find it difficult to stay with it. The sheer scope is off-putting to me in general. So when you first showed me the Barrowmaze tome, which is sizable in the version you have.
Sure, yeah.
And we're like, this is what I'm doing. I was like, oh boy, okay, cool. Since then, in listening to 3D6 down the line and their exploration of Ardenvool from time to time, I'm not an avid regular listener, unfortunately.
They just actually concluded their campaign in terms of the time of recording not too long ago, maybe 2 weeks ago.
Amazing.
Or less.
I hope there's a highlight reel.
And actually, this is just I'll put a show notes link to this. They did kind of a full teardown, like a 2-hour live stream teardown of talking through their entire experience. Obviously, going into lots of details that if you didn't watch the whole 100 and some odd episode show, which I have not made it through, but I'd actually like to go back and kind of fill in some of the gaps. They talk through it, and I actually, in preparing for this discussion, Jody, I watched a considerable portion of the live stream and some of their later episodes just so I kind of knew where they were ending. And I don't necessarily think that it's going to inform a lot of what I have to say about the Barrowmaze, but it was nice to kind of feel like I had another example to kind of use as a foil.
Awesome. Well, and that's kind of the kickoff to my first question I've got for you is, being that you have now run a sizable chunk of Barrowmaze, and you are the one who brought 3D6 Down the Line and Arden Fool to me and got me interested in listening to it and enjoying that podcast and that actual play. To you, what makes a good mega dungeon? I mean, in general, they're these large sprawling things, and there's kind of a known, this is what they are, but what do you see now in retrospect and in a little bit more informed light is just what makes for a good one?
Yeah, I have 4 things here. I know that in rhetoric you're supposed to, things come in threes, but I got 4. So I'm going to run these things down, and you can ask me some follow-up questions if you have them. So first, obviously mega dungeons need to be big. That's sort of their core conceit. But for me, they need to be chunkable, meaning the dungeon is sectioned and presents a diversity of experiences as it is explored. Chunkable dungeons mean that there are distinct either factions, we'll get to that in a second, but like that there's something different about different parts of the dungeon that distinguish them from the others. The second thing is that there needs to be strong but easy to understand and difficult to solve faction play. I don't think mega dungeons can survive on their own 2 feet of just cool room design, right? Or just, or just having interesting and fun monsters to fight. I think a mega dungeon almost requires faction play. And players need to be able to know what factions exist, and they need to know what their goals are, because ideally you want the players to get involved in factions and pit factions against one another and leverage factions for their own benefit. When you're in a dungeon, you have a limited set of things you can use to influence gameplay. You're in a defined space, and faction play is just one of those things that actually leads to near limitless, interesting story. My third one is, and this one is very, very, very much a me thing. I hate what I call lost delves. Essentially, you can think about these as like sessions or delves that the players basically completely forget. I know that this is not to everyone's taste, but I find that if a group goes into a mega dungeon and they come out without loot, knowledge, or allies, or some combination of those 3, but really one of those 3 even makes it a successful delve. Loot, knowledge, allies. If you come out with none of those things that are actionable or useful or that you invested time and energy in and are going to pay off later in some interesting way, I feel like those are lost delves. My final one is there needs to be many entry points, and there needs to be lots of looping paths, and ideally different levels. I think you can see one of my criticisms of Barrowmaze maybe shining through here, but there needs to be lots of interesting architectural and environmental features that encourages mapping and rewards using maps and rewards using the environment to the player's advantage. Of course, if you ask me on a different day, I might have a different set of 4, but I thought about these a lot. I listened to 3D6 Down the Line and kind of their thoughts on Arden Fool. I have read Dark Tower. I've read The Caverns of Thracia, or Thracia, or I don't know how to, I can never, these old modules.
That one I'm pretty confident is Thracia.
Okay. Well, I am but a humble idiot. So
you are the historian of us, but allow me to jump in on these 4 points
before I ramble on even more.
So a couple of these scream of just general good dungeon design.
Sure.
So,
sure.
Strong, easy to understand theme of dungeon. And here you specifically went into the factions within the dungeon, but that notion of I have a sense of place. The many entry points to me is kind of a like, that's generally good, see in my experience, what is generally referred to as jaquang of the dungeon, that there are loops, there are different architecture, variety is good. That chunkable one is mega dungeony though. That one feels uniquely mega dungeony. That usually in dungeon design, there is a theme for this dungeon. Runehammer famously put out the power word, as he calls it. You pick a word, and that word informs all of your decisions about the dungeon. I think that's a great model. That would not work for a mega dungeon. It's ice, and it is 600 rooms of ice. Don't do that. The one that really, though, I'd like you to maybe talk about more.
Sure.
Or speak to your own unique player and GMing preferences is the third one you touched on.
Yeah.
The no lost delves. Specific to mega dungeons and the Barrowmaze, that one jumps out to me as both. I know you as a player and GM and friend, and I know that's a bugaboo for you.
Huge.
Always.
Yes, always.
Why or how is it compounded by a mega dungeon experience?
So I just want to say that the reason I chose these four is certainly, Jody, they encompass good dungeon design in many ways. As a dungeon gets larger, strong faction play, many points, entry points, looping paths, interesting dungeon design, it just gets harder to pull off. Novelty is harder when you have 300 rooms or, whatever, right? So these things are harder to do the larger your dungeon gets, and factions across a 15, 20 room dungeon. Yeah, sure. There's strong factions in the Lost Citadel of the Scarlet Minotaur, right? I mean, that's a core element of that dungeon's design. But if you blow the dungeon up and you start to increase the complexity of the map and the space, etc., that becomes harder. So that's really why I chose those four, is because I feel like those four things are the hardest to do with a mega dungeon. There are obviously other components of a mega dungeon that I think are important, like having an easy to read map for the GM. Those are there's other things. Speaking to the third one, the No Lost Delves, this is a bugaboo for me as a player for sure. I'm going to go on. I know that folks will maybe disagree with me, and that's fine. You've heard this, I don't know how many times. For me, the mark of a good session is when the players leave and they don't think of what they could have been doing with their time other than playing the RPG in question, Shadowdark, etc. When I get up from the table and the players have left and I'm reflecting on a session, the worst thing for me is when I realize that the players ultimately got nothing out of that session of play. They invested real time, real hours of their real lives. And to me, failure on the part of me as a GM and the players is not actually creating any actionable content or extracting any value for the characters and for the world out of play. So yeah, if you leave the dungeon and you didn't get any loot, maybe you had to throw all your stuff away because you had to pay off somebody to get out of the dungeon, and you leave them with nothing, right? You got no torches, you got nothing, and you didn't really make any allies, and you maybe were retreading some of the paths that you already tread, and maybe because you as the GM restocked your dungeon, and now suddenly those same paths that you already have mapped and you've already been on 2-3 times have new enemies in the way. That just sucks. I find that to be just tedious, boring, and ultimately not a good use of time.
Yeah, and I think in my knowing this about you, but also taking this to heart as a GM and player of seeing that issue now, it's kind of like when you watch a movie and you know how a special effect was done, it's really hard to unsee how the special effect was done.
Yeah.
This is one of those when you start thinking along the lines of, I want to make sure that my players and their characters to a degree got something worthwhile other than we hung out and we played. That as adult players, when I was a kid, just hanging out and playing was reward enough. Now, saying maybe we can do a little better than we got to hang out and play. This isn't quite the worst day fishing is better than the best day of working or something. It's not quite one of those because it is a chunk of sitting around. I think the Mega Dungeon does kind of exacerbate this paradigm, though, of there's a lot to cover, right? Matt Colville has a great video about rooms and measuring the scope of progress by how many rooms did we get through.
Yeah.
Well, when you're in a Mega Dungeon, this ain't a 5-room dungeon, folks. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're done. It's hundreds of rooms often. So I think that notion of we went down, the whole point is to push out the map to see more of the space. So a session where that isn't happening in a way that has any value, that's tough. And, I know from some earlier discussion with you, there is potential for that being a problem with Barrowmaze.
Sure.
So let's structure the rest of our discussion as we move forward and really start just picking apart Barrowmaze, moving away from just mega dungeons and concept and talking really specifically now about Barrowmaze. Let's start with the things you wish were different, the areas using teacher speak, the areas for improvement.
Yeah.
And then we will end on our strengths and things that you were like, no, this was dope. This was good stuff. So why don't you kick us off? What was one of the things that you wish was different or maybe could be better?
Yeah. So the first thing I'm going to point out is not revelatory for anyone who's done any amount of research on Barrowmaze. Everyone points this out, is that it is a dungeon filled with undead, and it's primarily undead. The undead procession sort of is how I would describe this. And so for me, that wasn't a big deal to change, right? Like I could diversify the random encounter tables. I could just insert a roving adventuring party, a rival adventuring party, right? It wasn't hard to deal with, but if you play the module as written in terms of what's in every room, there's just a lot of undead, and it can get really samey. Couple that with undead are one of the most, and I don't have the restocking tables in front of me, but they are certainly one of the most common results on the restock table for in between delves. That means that your players are just going to be dealing with a lot of undead, which then has some knock-on effects. The first is that Turn Undead becomes the most important spell in the game almost from jump.
Well, and that I want to jump into that because with Shadowdark, you can cast it until you fail, so as much as you want in theory, and priests usually are built in such a way that they're above average at doing it.
Sure.
How did Turn Undead work? Did you have to modify it, or were priests just, hey, you're going to the Barrowmaze, bring a priest?
So interestingly enough, and I don't know if this is just our players, I didn't find it to be that big of a problem. I think we definitely had to figure out and rule, like, what happens if an enemy is turned and then they're attacked. Like, do they revert back, and are they unturned if you do harm to them? Which is where I landed. I ruled it the other way, and then I actually had to change that ruling and put it out in kind of like a, hey guys, this is, if you have 5 rounds to just beat up on an undead, like it actually does fundamentally change the way that things work because we were running this with Shadowdark. The second thing is like and I don't feel bad about that, making a slightly harsher ruling eventually, because the Barrowmaze book actually has an alternate Turn Undead table for clerics. I believe originally Barrowmaze was written for Labyrinth Lord, which was and I could be getting this wrong, I believe it was a BX clone, a retro clone of Basic and Expert, much like Old School Essentials. But the cleric Turn Undead table, which is a thing in those games, it is changed in the Barrowmaze book to make it worse. It's literally just a straight nerf of Turn Undead. And that, to me, actually reminds me of something that your wife likes to say, which is what?
Yeah, so this came about from board gaming years ago, and it's Matt and I have been fortunate enough both together and then independently, because we're homebrewers, we do a fair amount of design work just on our own. We're always kludging things. And what she said was, if a game has a rule that fixes a problem in the core system, the designer needed to spend more time to fix the core system. there's something wrong with the foundational mechanic if you have to write rules to fix the foundational mechanic, that it needed another pass. I think about that so often whenever I am considering designing something for Shadowdark or any game, or writing my own little homebrewy games or whatever I'm doing. Of the foundational system needs to work without hiccup or exception, generally speaking, because when you start tacking on those extra rules, it's just how it goes. And this is one of those also earmarkers of old school. I find it interesting that, frankly, Barrowmaze isn't older. It reads and feels older than it is, which maybe is a pop and a thumbs up if you're wanting that OSR experience. And this feels very OSR. And the reason I say that is it's super common to go into old modules, AD&D or BX modules. And at the beginning, there's especially in Gary Gygax written ones, there's a laundry list of these spells don't work or these spells work differently because the adventure won't work. And it's, well, why do they work differently? There's a magic barrier. There's an enchantment here and it just doesn't work. And it's just that hand wavy of like, oh, I cast this spell. No, it doesn't work. What? Yeah, it just doesn't work. You just can't fly here. I have the fly spell. Yeah, it doesn't work. Okay. And move on. So at least a kludge of like, it's been rewritten. But yeah, I mean, that screams to me. But you didn't run into problems with, other than like the aforementioned adjustment of, if you go up and whack them as they're running away, they will turn around and defend themselves. You know, the undead.
Yeah.
That was it, huh?
I didn't. Well, I mean, was it a problem? Maybe, but I think as a GM, just going into this, to me, the bad was not turn undead. It was the fact that turn undead became a very important spell. However, I don't know if it's just our players. Eventually, players just kind of were like, whatever. Like, either they had high enough level characters, they could just take care of skeletons and stuff. There are a preponderance of adjusted undead that do wild and crazy things later on in the module, some of which I liked and I kept, some of which I didn't really like the design of and I excised from the module altogether. But
do those varieties of undead, modified undeads, the skeletons with the gems in their head that you've used a few times, they're from Barrowmaze.
They're from Barrowmaze. There's fossilized skeletons. There's skeletons that explode. But here's the problem, right?
Does it help with the undead problem?
No, it doesn't, because there's a couple things. To me, I want to know why in a particular room you would find an undead of this type. And to me, this is getting into the kind of my second point, which is that it is difficult sometimes to understand what the heck is going on. Like, why is this monster in this room? Other than, I needed there to be a monster in this room, and that's where it starts to feel like very quote unquote old school, right? There's a clockwork cobra in this room. Why? You either really read deeply to understand, but it certainly doesn't say in the room description. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But and I'll be honest with you, I have skimmed the whole book, but I didn't have to read every room. So there might be some rooms that are a counterpoint and a counterfactual to that. But long story short, I found the story of the dungeon that I read at the beginning. That was me like going through the rule book and really trying my best to summarize the story as I understood it. I still don't fundamentally understand what is really going on in this dungeon as it pertains to play. Like, as it pertains to like the individual rooms and the sections of the dungeon. There is a beholder, Jody, in this dungeon, in a pit of chaos. And the players found it, and it was very cool, but I'm not sure why there's just a beholder. Like, it tries to explain it in the module a little bit, but it had the Monster Zoo problem, but it didn't have the Monster Zoo benefits, which is a large diversity of monsters. So the story is difficult to parse. The story didn't feel compelling in terms of like how I could deliver it to players. this point, I want to say this was frustrating for me. It was hard for me to describe the dungeon and describe the things in it without understanding and having a good sense of like what the heck was going on. So I simplified it and just used undead versus chaos. And even then, it was hard to parse the rooms sometimes because there's competing factions that it doesn't always translate what their goals are to the actual, like, the room key. I felt like there was a disconnect between the story that is presented at the beginning of the module and how the rooms feel and work and read as you're going through play.
So let me see if I understand this. And again,
that was a lot of words, but that's yeah.
This is really, I think, a sore spot for you, maybe more than for some listeners, because you love faction play. It is a huge part of your GMing true. Style, yeah. and you leverage it to wonderful effect in our Dolmenwood game. I know in your 5e game that same sort of deal, that there are different, the factions may be a single person, but there are still different competing interests, and you leverage those interests really well as a GM. It is a strength of your campaigns. Now, in the opening read, though, you gave us that long before even those ancient builders, the god of death, Nergal, ruled the underworld, he foresaw the betrayal of his sons, Orcus and Set, in a desperate gambit, and hid the most powerful artifact, the Tablet of Chaos, within the maze. Orcus and Set betray him. They're endlessly at war. Go find the tablets.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's pretty straightforward.
Yes. And then later, the cheerier of the voices mentioned there were other gods, no matter which one you like, that they'll be here too. That there are also all of the world religions of the world, which thematically for a giant barrow moor containing a labyrinthine layer of interconnected barrows underneath and tombs. Yeah, that makes sense actually in a world building sense. Yeah, I'd have a variety of religions represented, but
sure. Very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, but where it falls apart, if I'm understanding correctly, is that the Orcus and Set story doesn't play out in the rooms. So for me, I go, okay, well, there's a clockwork cobra, scorpion, whatever. What was it?
A clockwork cobra.
Cobra. That screams Set. Okay, it's Set. That's Set. That goes with Set, and I got it. I understand why that is. That's me assuming a bajillion things from old fantasy brain that I go, okay, I understand what this is. And I know there's demonic stuff, and I go, okay, Orcus, demonic stuff, got it. Am I understanding correctly that it's basically once you get down underground and start your torchlit delves, that story seems to just fade into the stones?
It just, the waters get muddied. At least, okay, so this, again, this might just be me and not having maybe a long history of this kind of fantasy, smorgasbord of things, right? But what I found was that the rooms and the room descriptions did not necessarily clue me in to how make specific and concise and clear connections between a faction and a particular room. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. There's just a lot of stuff that actually actively works against the players. There's a lot of red herrings in the dungeon.
Oh.
And I don't mean red herrings in terms of like, so for instance, the rumors that you hear in Helix that are listed in the module, there's a lot of false rumors. Not bad. One of the greatest rumors in any game I've ever played came out of this module. Always go north.
That's right.
You were playing that game.
Yeah,
that was one of the first sessions. That was actually the first session we ever ran in Barrowmaze, and somebody rolled up the always go north, and it was great. Well, that's a lovely rumor because it encourages exploration. Whereas some of the rumors are about parts of the Barrowmaze that you're never going to get to. Or if I say never, you might not. Because I found it very difficult to give actionable pieces of information about where stuff was, because I couldn't figure out what the sections of the dungeon were about. I couldn't tell players, that would be in the northwest corner of the dungeon. I obviously wouldn't tell them that just verbatim and above table. I couldn't find ways to work in information into my my delivery as a GM. And that was very weird because that tends to be something that I enjoy doing. I look for excuses to give players information, sometimes to my own detriment, right? Like I give too much information. And I actually make things more trivially easy to find or to do. But that was the hard part. I don't know if it was if it was the formatting and the presentation of information, the challenge of finding what I think are important pieces of information buried in room descriptions in rooms that my players might never get to, having to cross-reference stuff between rooms. I mean, there's not even really good overviews of each section. There's just section titles, or area titles, area 1, area 2, area 3, etc. Well, those area titles are sometimes evocative, but they conflicted with what the players were experiencing. And so what I found is that during play, Barrowmaze was fun. When I was running for players who were just dungeon delving, it was an absolute chore when I wanted to try and give any sort of narrative complexity, stakes, or set dressing. No pun intended. It was just it conflicted with my proclivities as a GM. And again, this might not be for everybody, or this might not be true for everybody, but this was probably the biggest and most difficult aspect for me, was a disconnect between the overall story and the experience of running individual rooms and areas in the dungeon.
Right, and that being to one of your highlight points of providing actionable item information to your players. Yeah. And yeah, that is a tough one, and you kind of said it, like that screams a formatting concern of this is going to be an academic exercise if you want to run this thing. Like if you're going to have to do substantial homework. And that's always the knock on running any module, let alone a module with 200-ish rooms.
300.
Okay, 300-ish rooms. I wasn't sure there. That's a lot. Speaking of rooms, and this is, yeah. I know you have this in your like critique zone. This immediately actually was one of the things when you kind of, now years ago, we're like, I'm going to run this Barrowmaze thing. It was dope. And then you start telling me about it. I was like, wait, confusing. Classic levels in an OSR, yeah. OD&D sense. Level dungeons literally are supposed to correlate to character levels. When you are level 1, you go into level 1 of the dungeon. If you accidentally descend to level 2, 3, or 4, you are out of your depth. Literally. And you are going to face challenges not appropriate to your level. The Barrowmaze is, per your really well-written intro description there, because it covered all of these bases, is a single level. How do the players know if they're out of their depth?
This goes back to the story is difficult to parse. There aren't good, well-defined barriers between different sections. Technically speaking, the further east you go, the harder the dungeon gets. But there's also the north-south axis, which I think there are individual rooms in parts of the dungeon that are in the west that are bananas and are way past anything that low-level characters should. So really, it's the further you get away from what is entrance 12, which is the entrance that is known about at the beginning. It's kind of the standard entrance to the Barrowmaze, entrance 12 or Barrow Mound 12. Further you get away from there, that's when things get wonky. The fact that the map is a single level, though, I think works against this module in a profound way for a couple of reasons. Number one, exactly like you said, Jody, it's difficult for players to know how difficult stuff is going to be. I had players who were trying to figure out the different barrow mounds, like which ones were, generally speaking, more challenging. And my argument was always like, look, the higher the number, usually the numbers kind of get bigger as you go east. And so the higher the number, the more challenging. And that is true. Like there are some barrow mounds that lead to the Barrowmaze. There are also barrow mounds that do not. There are lots of barrow mounds that are just their own individual dungeons, some keyed, some not. But the barrow mounds that are higher numbers, generally speaking, take you to more difficult places in the Barrowmaze. It's another example of just muddying the waters. Like the desire to make this dungeon a single level, or the decision to make it a single level, actively works against just an easy way to, from a meta standpoint, just give players and GMs an understanding that this area is different than this area. Right? All told, if you look at the map, you can't tell where the areas start and end. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes I would be looking at rooms and I would go, oh, that's a cool looking room, because some of the room design on the map is actually quite cool. And I would look at it and it would be a part of an area that I felt like I was like, I don't understand why this room is in this area. See aforementioned Beholder room. That was kind of strange. But the map being a single level means that it's hard to get from one area to another. There aren't very many teleportation circles, if any. At least not that my players didn't find any. And so unless you have teleportation magic that allows you to go, you have to get out of the dungeon and go to a different barrow mound and go down to a different location. So you are essentially bound to a particular location in the dungeon, a particular area, geographically, for any given delve. And that is something that I think Arden Vool, having watched a lot of the 3D6 down the line actual play, Arden Vool solved that in a genuinely, I think, triumphant way with, I don't want to give anything away about that module since we're not reviewing it, but like it created a system for moving around the dungeon that not only rewarded exploration, but also managed to capture what I see as the kind of the fun of going around a mega dungeon, which is sometimes finding yourself in places where you're like, oh my gosh, where the heck are we?
So unless there's something else that's really just stuck in your craw here, let's move on from your critiques. Undead. It's a little bit tough on the story, single level. What was the good stuff out of this? Because I'm going to steal your top line item here. Every week, people came back to explore Barrowmaze for roughly 2 years and were delighted to do so every month. That they wanted to. We ran this game every month, and they wanted to pop in and see more of it. So clearly the players did not feel daunted by some of these issues. So what was it you enjoyed from this thing? And what are the positives for somebody who maybe is going, oh man, I was excited about Barrowmaze and now it sounds dumb.
Yeah, so this is why it depends. It was fun for the players. I do think that by the time we stopped after 2 years of monthly play, it had run its course. So I don't know how many sessions that was exactly, but I do think that there is an expiration date on the fun. The things we just talked about do end up weighing on the game. However, players enjoyed it. Also, despite my concerns about the map being a single level, I actually think the map and like the design of the map, with all of those critiques in place, is quite good. There's looping paths. There are fun rooms. Some of the rooms in Barrowmaze are wonderful for somebody like me because they don't often give you a ton of information about like what a particular thing is doing in a room. And so it allowed me to be creative. It allowed me to change things, to swap out monsters that I felt like weren't like, why is this monster here? There's a whole section that has like lots of gargoyles, and I had to make some decisions about like, what are gargoyles in this world and in this dungeon? And it was super cool. And the gargoyles ended up, I basically just made them ostensibly slightly leveled down stone golems, which are super gnarly. Mm-hmm. And so it made the gargoyles way, way more terrifying than maybe they were supposed to be. But there are just a couple of rooms that are so memorable, even though it's out of place, or at least it felt like it was out of place to me. A floating eyeball monster is always fun, man. Like, I mean, how can you not love characters opening up a door and there being a floating eyeball monster? So for me, I was a little lenient sometimes on how players could open doors and what they could get into. There are some places in the module where if I was running it really prescriptively and strictly that it maybe characters shouldn't have been able to get into. The eyeball monster is a good example. But what better way to terrify low-level characters than letting them run into a beholder?
Yeah, I walked in and here's the 10-eyed oracle just hanging out.
Oh,
Stay
indeed.
a while and listen. It's probably not what he sounds like.
So the map is genuinely, I think, cool and full of good ideas in various locations.
My critique of old school and you go down levels and those levels, that is not how any game, Shadowdark or any other modern game really works. Like very rarely do you see level 1 is filled with level 1 and level 0 monsters. Level 2 is filled with this range of you're just not seeing much of that anymore. It's more, what is the story and does the story make sense? And I'll say, even for my very limited experience playing in the Barrowmaze and talking to players every, month when we ran these games, the mapping piece was a huge part of enjoyment for everybody who played in this. And the single level does heighten the desire for mapping between mounds. Having relatively accurate maps becomes an interesting problem or prospect of, oh, I found this secret door and then this covered up chamber walks me to somewhere else. And those things were really, really enjoyable. The weird monster zoo aspects, people did love that, of coming out and being like, what did we fight this week? Even though it was undead on undead, it felt like every time adventurers went down, they came back with some story of some crazy thing they had fought or seen that they hadn't seen before.
Mummies are, if you're running Barrowmaze with Shadowdark, just lean into mummies. I just have them roaming around, or have them in most sarcophaguses, and then players will think twice about opening sarcophagi. We didn't talk about because we've talked about it so much before, but the fact that the treasure in this module is bananas. But if it's guarded by mummies,
right? Well, and the treasure is, I think, maybe the most it depends item of the whole thing.
Yeah.
If you're playing Barrowmaze as a bespoke campaign, that is what you're doing. We are going to the Barrowmaze and we're going to Helix, and that's what we're doing. The treasure you pull out of the Barrowmaze is dope and exciting and varied and interesting and just a lot of fun. If you are crossing over, and it's one of my thoughts, is use Barrowmaze as maybe break it up and drop it all over your world, or it is a spot your party can go to. They don't have to. Nothing is currently unraveling there. It's just a place they know about that's weird, and they can go as much as or as little as they want. Caution on blending the loot and treasure in the Barrowmaze with other outside sources. So that's why I say it's a great example of the it depends. Is
totally,
it's rad there, and a lot of it is bespoke to the factions in the area, so you can have a lot of fun with that. And we, in our crossover between some characters bouncing between the Caves of Chaos and the Barrowmaze, once we kind of got it dialed in, there was some really fun stuff about alignment and how, I lean really heavily into alignment in my game. So if people showed up with certain items, I would, these zombies only are interested in you. They are entirely ignoring Bob, but they're attacking the crap out of the rest of you. So there were some really fun interactions, but it is just a caution. How is the book itself?
Yeah.
Like the physical tome, it looks rad from my outside eye. And the map that you had printed up, the great big Barrowmoor map, is, I think, man, do that. Give that to your players from jump. The thought of having to go and self-map the Barrow mounds to me feels like just you're not gaining anything by doing that. Like, just give them that. But yeah, talk to me about the book itself. I feel like if we're actually reviewing Barrowmaze as a book, how is the book?
So the book, I got a print-on-demand copy of the 10th anniversary edition from Drive-Thru RPG, and I have written in it in my true form. It is dog-eared, written in, things are crossed out, circled, highlighted, etc. All that good stuff for all you haters out there. The book is great. The map that I have that is full color is a I guess, a third party or a fan creation that I found, I believe, on Reddit. I can see if I can pull the link out of, I don't know where I found it, and it was a long time ago. But there have been lots of fan created materials for Barrowmaze that either make it easier to play online, because there's some pretty solid VTTs or VTT maps that have been developed. The book is good. However, it does not have the or adhere to the design and layout principles of modern indie RPGs. Like it was not written in the Gavin Norman OSE, Hull in the Oak or what have you style. It does suffer, I think, from its age and the fact that I think it was written to emulate the old school modules that it is kind of paying homage to. So the quality of the book is fine. I mean, it's lasted me for a couple of years and hasn't like broken down. It's not, it's black and white, which I like. It goes along with Shadowdark quite nice. The full color map, I actually was like, oh man, I kind of wish this was a black and white rendition, but the actual hex map in the Barrowmaze book is like a pretty minimal. I agree, mapping the hexes and the barrow mounds would be tedious at best for our groups. But ultimately the book has a lot of good stuff in it. It is just not particularly easy to use. The best part of the book, Jody, is the illustrations. These, I don't want to say the best. This is the part that I think, I don't mean, again, no pun intended, it's a lost art. There are illustrations in the book that are specifically designed to be handed out or shown to players when they enter particular rooms of consequence. And they are awesome. I think more dungeons and more modules should do this. The amount of one of the reasons I love Call of Cthulhu adventures and modules is because they often come with a preponderance of handouts. I just don't see as much creativity in the OSR and in fantasy role playing in terms of handouts that I do in like other spaces. So for Call of Cthulhu, there's so many, there's entire companies that are predicated on handouts as being a part, like that's like what they do. They make handouts. I want to see this for Shadowdark. I want to see people developing in-world handouts for Shadowdark modules. I would love to see stuff made for the Scarlet Minotaur. It's something that I do, but I do it bespoke for my players. This was like such a joy and such a boon to have. And there is one image, and it's the first image you show your characters. And it's just an image of when they get into the Barrowmaze. It's an image of a corridor. That's it. And it is, to me, the hardest thing to describe in a dungeon are the hallways.
Sure, because you've seen one, you've seen them all, but you've never seen one. So is it different? Is it unique? Is it what's interesting?
And it's so atmospheric. There's the final room of the dungeon has the tablet, the eponymous tablet of chaos that we referenced at the beginning. Like, those are things that maybe some people will scoff at because they want to be able to describe it and have each player imagine it. But these are not highly detailed images, and they are cool and interesting. And I think they are one of the things that actually actively makes this book significantly better than it might otherwise be, just because it shows a level of time, care, and consideration for the space that, even though it didn't jive with me, it really, I think the illustrations are one of the unsung heroes of the module.
I think this is actually fascinating because in the modern era, especially for drive-through RPG, where you can often at minimal increased cost or potentially not increased cost, get the PDF and the book in a bundle. which is kind of standard practice. You get the digital, which means you can, at home in most cases, print these handouts. This sounds so dumb, but you have my head spinning on this because I run so many of those old BX modules and AD&D modules and work those into my campaigning and my playing, that it's actually kind of frustrating because I don't want to cut up these things. and
yeah,
while I'm kind of indifferent to, like I wrote in my book, these are tough enough now to track down. I'm not buying reprints and stuff
they're collector's items in many cases.
Some of them, they're when some of them go for $100 a pop.
Lost City.
Yeah, I'm not chopping that one up. And so I have to figure out like, okay, well, can I make a photocopy and then can I do something with the photocopy? And there are more steps involved. Whereas for something like Barrowmaze, where you can literally go to DriveThruRPG and for an extra $10, you get the PDF right there along with your hardcover book. Man, the ability to hand those printouts and easily access them and get them into your players' hands. I couldn't agree with you more that it's such a valuable tool and something we've moved away from, because again, those old AD&D BX modules almost always had some handout to be found in them.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like a letter. Even if it's just like right. the first real role-playing game that I ever played was with you, and it was a 5th edition game, and we started the campaign, and you gave us all individual letters that you had, you'd stained some paper to make it look old. You printed it up, you folded them up in a really cool way, and you handed us each a letter from kind of the quest giver.
Yep.
Yeah, there you go. So that was my first real foray into role-playing games. And I've never really gotten over that, right? Like I feel like role-playing games are unique because that's something like you can't do that in, or it wouldn't have the same impact in almost any other kind of tabletop game, right? Because it feels like you are being given a gift in concert with your character, to be given something that heightens the feeling of being in a space, that makes it more real, that increases the verisimilitude or what have you. I don't know. That just that to me is like a no-brainer. And I know that it's more work to get illustrations done. I know that it's more work for GMs to make this stuff from whole cloth. But I don't know, man. The illustrations were a boon, and I made some handouts for this. I got away from making handouts, but I made handouts specifically because of how difficult it was to convey the dang story.
Right. Well, I mean, at the end, it was a delight when I came in the day after you'd played the level 10 game, and I saw some of those handouts were sitting on the table, which said, and I know the players had those.
Oh, yeah. So
it was neat to see them go, oh, look, this is the such and such of so-and-so, and this is their symbol, and this is their mark, and oh, I have this one. And so as goofy as it may sound, the notion that like, hey, here's this giant 300-room mega dungeon that is it depends of a review. At the end of the day, though, the illustrations are really good. They're evocative. They paint a picture. And if you're willing to go through a few steps, they'll really help your players to see and feel the sense of place and feel grounded in it. That's actually no small feat.
There is so much about this dungeon to recommend. It's just, it feels to me like, and I don't mean this in any sort of a bad way. It should be smaller. Like the dungeon, it needs to be distilled. Like the dungeon needs to be distilled into like there's a lot of chaff, there's a lot of extraneous stuff, there's a lot of rooms that maybe, and I know size is a factor in mega dungeons, but all those things you just said, like, would be more impactful if players saw illustrations a little bit more often. Not every session, but like a little bit more often, right? So those things could be distilled, and players could have a little bit more frequent interactions with the cool parts of the dungeon.
Speaking of distillation and distilling some ideas, let's hear from a sponsor and then bring this topic to the light and try and distill some points for our listeners.
This episode of Dungeon Master Diaries is sponsored by the Brazen Strumpet, the only tavern in the region where the ale is strong, the barmaids are stronger, and nobody asks questions they don't want honest answers to. Located smack dab in the heart of the village of Helix, the Brazen Strumpet is your one-stop shop for warm stew, cold beer, and hot goss. Owned and operated by the ever-watchful Bolo the barkeep, who sees everything. Trust us. The Strumpet is where adventurers go to find work, drink off failure, or brawl with that one guy who keeps bragging about single-handedly killing Ossitrax Pejorative, whoever that is. Drop by during the day if you're looking for peace and quiet, or stumble in after dusk for music, rumors, and a punch in the face. Tip well, and the barmaids might just point you towards your next big haul. Or someone else's poorly guarded treasure map. Need hirelings, henchfolk, frenemies, rivals, bad decisions? You'll find them all at the Brazen Strumpet. And if you're lucky or terribly unlucky, you might even meet Alistair, the village idiot. No, seriously, don't turn your back on him. The Brazen Strumpet, where every story starts and far too many of them end.
All right, it is time for us to bring this topic into the light with some core takeaways from our review and rambling discussion around the Barrowmaze. Matt, kick us off. What you got?
All right, Barrowmaze is definitely one of the mega dungeons.
Yep.
I don't know how to. I really enjoyed running this. It definitely ran out of steam, at least for me. By the end, I was ready to be done, and it has some pretty glaring issues, but I think that there's something good in there. And so if a GM wanted to make it great for their players, and some of this stuff felt like more positives than negatives that we've talked about today, I think it's well worth your time. I think it is a cool dungeon. I just think it needed a little bit more work to fine-tune and distill the good stuff.
Man, my favorite editing phase is what I call the big black Sharpie, where you just cross stuff off and you're just like, get rid of this, get rid of this, get rid of this, get rid of this, because what's left is amazing. I don't know if it would still be mega, but it would definitely still be a dungeon. You know what? I'm going to echo what you said in that in this review, funny enough for me, I really actually am now very Barrowmaze curious and would love to run it, which is kind of a problem since you know it pretty well. It would be weird if I started running it, but there's so much there. If nothing else, undead versus demons or chaos is like this classic matchup. Certainly if you're into Warhammer lore at all, it definitely is. But even in Sea Orcus, I love that stuff. It's so classic, but it's still so new and reinventable. And so for me, actually, this review has increased my desire to know more about Barrowmaze. So take that for what you will as my top line takeaway. I'm stoked about it and genuinely curious.
And if you do end up picking this up, steal ideas from it, steal rooms, steal areas. And I think you mentioned this in a very briefly, Jody, but I think you could take entire areas out of this module and just plop them in random places in your world, or just kind of kludge, fence in different areas. There's enough diversity in the areas, and sometimes, like I said, I couldn't figure out why certain rooms were in certain areas. Maybe I'm just an idiot, but long story short, I think you could wholesale just pick this thing up for parts and ideas and rooms. So that's my other big takeaway is there's a lot of good stuff in here, and I feel like I've said that a lot, but I just wanted to harp on it one more time.
Well, if nothing else, harvesting modules for good ideas is a way to go. My last takeaway is this. When I think a lot of people get in love with the idea of a mega dungeon, I think as a GM, you need to be realistic about your play group and your attention span. My wife's play group, when I met her, their GM was famous for 3 sessions and done. No matter what system they were playing, they were going to play 3 sessions and then they would never play that system again because he'd be excited to move on. Mega Dungeon, not for that guy. time to move on. So just, my last takeaway is how much is too much for your table? Be realistic with yourself, be realistic about that with your players, and then rock on with your bad self. All right, friends, as the torchlight grows dim, we hope you were able to find something useful in this episode that you can take into a future game. If you have any questions or unique experiences from your table that you'd like us to discuss on a future episode, you can email us, because we're the ones talking, at dmdiariespod@gmail.com. You can also reach out to us on YouTube or Facebook, or best of all, in the Dungeon Master Diaries thread on the Shadowdark Discord channel. You can find links to those feeds and any of the materials we referenced in this show's episode notes, whatever. Until next time, may your barrows be dark and your brazen strumpets be light.
Incredible. Dungeon Master Diaries is a production of the Stingbat Radio Network and is produced by Jody Kropholler and edited by me, Matt Bruner. Our intro and outro music is composed by Christian Schuster, and Dungeon Master Diaries is an independent production, is not affiliated with the Arcane Library, LLC. Shadowdark RPG is a product of the Arcane Library. Copyright 2023!
We support strumpets.